All right. Howdy, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining us for our talk today. The talk is called A Dev's Guide to Empowering PMs and Data Scientists with Experimentation. We could also include things like product owners and other roles, but the title would just get too long. So we'll stick with this. I'm Aaron Montana. I'm an experimentation specialist at LaunchDarkly. I manage a small team there that helps customers implement experimentation and talk about the practice of experimentation with customers. Joining me on the stage is Dan Hunt.
How's it going, everyone? I'm Dan Hunt. I'm a partner solution architect at Snowflake. So I work with all of our different partners, including the likes of LaunchDarkly, but also with a big focus specifically on AWS. So back to you, Aaron.
Cool. All right, Dan is going to explain a lot more later, but I'm really excited to jump in and talk to you about experimentation and how to bring it to your teams. And we'll start with a little quote. There is an online bookstore operator by the name of Jeff Bezos. Maybe you've heard of him. He's kind of a big deal. And he once said, "Our success at Amazon is a function of how many experiments we do per year, per month, per week, per day." Interesting quote. You know, I've encountered this quote quite a bit as somebody who works in experimentation. We show this quote a lot. I went looking for the source, and it was not an interview, which I had been led to believe. This was actually a quote from an investor letter in one of their financial quarterly statements or yearly statements that he wrote to the investors as part of that, which I think tells you a little something about the value of experimentation being something that at the investor level, even for a large company. And on that note, here's what we're going to talk about today so that you can bring that kind of value to your teams. First, we're going to talk about building an experimentation program and some best practices. I'm going to bring you some best practices from the field, things that I do with the teams that I coach. Then we're going to talk about scaling the program and connecting your data ecosystem to it. And then Dan's going to jump in and talk about the Snowflake ecosystem and how that plays. And then finally, we'll talk about what happens when you get tools together, like the way that we've implemented LaunchDarkly and Snowflake together, and how to run experiments with advanced analysis. So I hope you're excited. Let's jump into it. All right, so building an experimentation program. Let's start with just a basic understanding of experimentation. You all actually covered this in your early years of school, sometimes even at the elementary level. But it's important to kind of remember what it is we're doing and why we do it. The process of experimentation is something to systematically do controlled testing in an environment to gather data and then make informed decisions with that data. So essentially, you have a true standard of practice for how you will gather data and make sure that it's valid, and then you'll use that to actually make the decisions so that we're not going with our gut all the time. But why do we do this? Why do we put in this effort? Well, there's a ton of benefits from the culture that comes along with experimentation. Sometimes you'll hear it called the test and learn culture. There's other kinds of phrases for this, but it's a really popular topic. Here are 3 pillars of this culture that I find really resonate across the board with pretty much any organization. The first reason that we do experimentation in an organization is that it drives financial gains, pure and simple. So it improves your ROI, but it also helps you avoid costly mistakes by figuring out what's not working as quickly as possible. The other thing it does is it instills a culture of learning. The culture of learning is interesting, and it is not exactly the same as the culture of experimentation. It is a part of it. This is a culture that attaches data to all of your initiatives. In other words, it trains the people within your teams, within your org, to think about their problems in terms of how they will measure the outcome. This becomes really important, and it leads to another very interesting side effect, which is that it creates a framework to learn. So we talk a lot about failing fast or failing up, and this is a buzzword that's been going around for a long time. What we don't talk about too much is the fact that this is super uncomfortable. It is really uncomfortable for engineers, I come from an engineering background, to try something and fail, and it just doesn't work. When you create a culture of learning, you create a framework for people to fail safely and comfortably and have really interesting and sometimes disruptive ideas. So this is a major benefit. And then the final one, which seems related but is in fact its own thing, is the idea of continuous improvement. So a lot of companies, Amazon, Netflix, Google, these big companies that we know and are real market leaders have built in this process of testing, iterating, and repeating into pretty much everything they do. It's in their DNA. And then they leverage that data to improve user experience, to improve performance, to improve all kinds of things. The reason that we also need to do this within our own orgs is actually because other people are doing it. So we cannot actually create things and simply let them be as they were and hope that that works out. We have to continually improve things because our competitors in whatever market we're in are doing the same. So this part of the continuous improvement pillar is just something that we find all over the market. Here at LaunchDarkly, we work with developers really closely. In turn, that means we work with your product owners, your product managers, all the people across your org, because development sits at the center of almost everything that we do. Software is eating the world, as they say. And so you will find that the developer is sort of at the center of everything being done. We truly believe that you should optimize every software release. This is really well fit with what we're supposed to do with experimentation. And so we have really sought out the idea and kind of worked with the developers that we work with to instill this idea in the feature management and what you can do with it as far as optimization goes in everything you do. So this means that new ideas which get turned into features that are built and then put behind flags are measured. So we measure the success of these things with experiments. It's kind of the best way to do this. We conduct advanced analysis on what we learn, and then we make sure that we ship the best thing. This is a virtuous cycle because we learn more and more and we improve more and more. And LaunchDarkly's feature management system really gives you the tools and the foundation to do this. And it's one of the reasons I'm up here on the stage today to make sure that we can spread this message around to the kinds of people that do this kind of work. All right, so here are some tips from the field. Things that I have learned just work really well when we try to get teams to start doing experimentation or start doing it well. So the first thing with getting started is getting started. And great experiments really start with great problems. So in other words, you run an experiment to solve a problem. And the things that you do to get to that stage of solving the problem are the experiment. So we plan these things. This is part of the scientific method. We want to make sure that we could hand a test plan, the instruction guide to exactly what we're going to do in this experiment, to somebody else. And they would know exactly what we intended to do, how we did it, and potentially they could replicate our results. They could run the same experiment. This is something that makes a lot of sense in health research and other kinds of experimentation, but it extends just as well into online experimentation and the kind of experimentation that developers do with software every single day. So these kinds of plans include the problem you're trying to solve. They're including things like the hypothesis, which embeds the primary metric of what you're going to measure, and a lot of meta information. A lot of information about who owns this, how long it's going to take, what the difficulty level might be, all kinds of things that are really good for absorbing into other systems so that you have a really great idea, a catalog of experiments you've run, intend to run, and a treasure trove of data about experimentation. These test plans are invaluable documents. Now, a lot of the teams I talk to have something similar to this in their ticketing system or in their project planning system, and that's totally fine. I often get people to do this in a Word doc or a Google doc, but the format is not nearly as important as the content. Now, another thing that you will see in any good test plan is the metrics, what you're going to measure. And the other thing that's really important about experimentation is understanding and measuring what matters. So we really tell stories with data. So an experimentation is really good at driving this. Experimentation really requires a primary metric, but that comes along with a lot of secondary metrics and other things we may consider. Some of these things are guardrails. They're there to make sure that you don't have unintended consequences. Other of these things are more like behavioral analysis or analytics, things that tell you more about what your users did or a larger story about what is going on. Every test plan should include these things, and what you'll find is that you are repeating many of these things in test to test to test, and that's good. That means that you have points of comparison between all the tests that you're running, and you can look back and forth between how they perform. All right, here's another one. This is really in the weeds. This is called parameterization. So here's a little, kind of a dirty little secret in experimentation. A lot of the experiments you run won't do anything. They're not flat. I mean, they're not learners or losers, and they're not winners. They're flat. They just have no effect. Users just didn't even notice what you were trying to do. I know that's kind of sad, but it's okay. You'll get used to it. And one of the ways that we keep this productive is to make sure that we parameterize wherever we can. And this simply means finding where we can use our experimentation system to inject the value that gets used as the content of the experiment as much as possible. So think of this as things like the text in a banner. Do I need to go through a full release process to change the text of that banner? This is going to slow down my experimentation iteration process. Instead, I would much rather put that into the tool if I can. Are the experiments we're running based on query parameters or parameters for a search appliance or something like that? If so, great. Throw those into parameters. AI brings a whole new level of interest in this exact area because a lot of AI models are driven by parameters. Things like sentiment or warmth or the amount of tokens you're going to need to complete the task. These kinds of parameters are perfect for parameterization within your experimentation system. This will allow you to run much faster iterations of your experiments as quickly as possible. Another one that seems kind of obvious, but I always make sure to point this out, is that experimentation dashboards are really super important. You need a kind of uniform way for most of your experiments to be displayed to people who will make the decisions on the data. And you shouldn't have to have a data scientist next to you in all cases to make this decision. A lot of experimentation gets put into the hands of people who just need to make decisions based on pretty simple approaches to the data, and those kinds of dashboards should be readily available to you. If you need to remake a dashboard or recreate reports every time you run an experiment, or more often than not, then this is a tip specifically for you. LaunchDarkly, for example, creates a beautiful dashboard every time you create an experiment. You only need to send us the primary metric of the experiment itself. Another thing that I'll mention here, and I think that this is really important and maybe it's thought of a little bit less, is the idea of slicing data. So within the LaunchDarkly dashboard, for example, you can slice the data that you send us along attributes of those users or other kinds of context. This allows you to achieve some baseline personalization, actually. If we can split groups up into broader categories and determine what works for them specifically, then we can direct them to that exact experience, while others may get another experience. This is not the user level of personalization that we often think about, but it's super effective. And it's much easier to do and coordinate than the kinds of personalization systems you may be diving into for other aspects. LaunchDarkly is a control plane in your code base with a dashboard that you control. The kinds of targeting that you need to do is typically based on these exact attributes. And so whenever possible, I try to look at categorical things in my user base that I may want to directly target those users for based on the outcome of an experiment. All right, to kind of wrap up the tips here. There's one more tip that is just super important, and it's not technical at all, and it's to share your findings. So I could get on a stage and talk to any organization about experiments that they have run or I have seen run, and it will mean little to nothing to them because I don't really speak the language of their organization. It's really important to share your findings. Sharing what you learned helps others, and it also encourages them to try experimentation. And within your own organization, you have a really powerful voice to do this. If you were to get on this stage in front of your teams and your organizations and talk about experiments that you ran, then you use their language, you know what's important to those folks, and it will really encourage them and garner interest in experimentation. And that's why it's the most important thing almost that you can do after you've run an experiment is to present the results of the experiment to as many people as possible. There's an interesting quote here, which comes from the Harvard Business School, and it says that the brain's preferences for stories over pure data stems from the fact that it takes in so much information every day. And I think we can all relate to that, right? The stories that we hear, like the stories that we can tell with data, are much more compelling than if I just send you a spreadsheet of results. Okay, so next up we need to talk about scaling this out. Right? Those tips that I gave you are very good for getting started. Once you get started, you'll want to do more. Once you start presenting your data back to other people in your org, they'll want to do more. How do you scale this up? And why do we even do it? Because there is some effort involved in scaling an experimentation program. There's some effort involved in doing it at all. Well, the thing is, scale is the key to achieving the program value. Right? You need to run a lot of experiments to actually see the improvement. Remember earlier I mentioned a lot of the experiments you run will be flat. In other words, they won't show an effect at all. Experimentation really excels at marginal gains, 1%, 2% at a time. This is a reproduction of a graph from James Clear's novel Atomic Habits. In that book, he presents the idea that you could improve things 1% at a time. This is true for organizations as well. And in fact, this is exactly how experimentation operates at scale in large organizations. We run a lot of experiments to see very little improvement. But over the course of time, those improvements really add up. So we've solved all the problems. We could probably end the presentation. But we didn't exactly solve the problems because actually we kind of created some more problems for ourselves, right? So we have a very good system now for doing experimentation. We have some tips and tricks, and we could actually follow this diagram, and this would lead us through running some experiments. But we're going to run into these kind of shared issues across the industry. One is that most organizations are moving towards or have already moved towards a single source of truth model. Looks at Dan knowingly. Another thing here is that we have a lot of lagging indicators. This is one of the reasons we use these single source of truth models. Another thing here is that we're going to run into complex metrics and data silos, places where data is kind of siloed all on its own. Each of these things, in turn, makes it kind of difficult to actually do experimentation because we're gathering a lot of events. So here is just a very simple example, right? We have somebody clicking on something, triggering an event API. This event API somehow makes its way through many systems to turn into a conversion rate somewhere. But what's really happening is a little bit more complicated than that, right? A lot of the people in this room are probably very familiar with this. Events can kind of come from any places, and your application is sending events maybe back and forth to all kinds of places. There are so many sources for events. Should you be sending them all to something like LaunchDarkly? Probably not. When we break down that test plan we went back into, we can see that a lot of these events, which will become the metrics for our experimentation program, they're coming from all over the place, right? Maybe a loyalty program service, a third party that you use, or just a standalone application that tracks loyalty programs. Maybe a lot of them come from within the web application, or are what we typically consider behavioral analysis, so something that would go into your behavioral analytics system. And then even some that are more of models themselves, right? So it's something like lifetime value, where we have a whole team potentially of folks who work on understanding what the lifetime value of a customer is. These things do not magically get computed all the time. A lot of the times, it's much more complicated than that, and where that data lives can be kind of spread out. If only a tool existed for this exact problem.
Thanks for the layup there, Aaron. All right, so now we're getting into the Snowflake gate crashing LaunchDarkly as part of the presentation, where I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what you can start to do once you've got all this data and how you can use that to start improving the experiments you're running. Before I get into things, can I get a quick show of hands? Who's heard of Snowflake or who's familiar with Snowflake? Wow, okay, so we got most of the people in the room. That's great news. So what I'm going to do today is I'll first give a brief overview of the Snowflake platform, just in case there's a couple of people in between. We'll keep that brief. Then I'll talk about how Snowflake can be useful in the context of experimentation. And then we'll get into the heart of this overlap with LaunchDarkly, which is the concept of building applications in Snowflake. So I'll explain the motivation around why you might want to do that, some of the different ways you can work on building applications in Snowflake, and how LaunchDarkly is building their application in Snowflake. And then I'll close things up with an architecture end-to-end, just to contextualize all of these things that I've mentioned. All right, so what is Snowflake? Fundamentally, Snowflake as a platform exists to break down data silos within organizations. We launched about 10 years ago, where before that, there wasn't really a way to truly scale analysis on your data as a business. And this led to a lot of bespoke systems that were confined to the limits of the infrastructure that each organization had. And Snowflake, when it launched, removed these limits. Because it was a cloud-native platform, you could scale almost limitlessly, bringing all of the data for your organization into one place and being able to easily scale your analysis across all of that. So that broke down silos within a given part of a business, but we started to see a new set of silos emerge. So within a typical company, there might be a lot of different teams, maybe different organizations across different regions in the globe, maybe even different cloud providers. So Snowflake's next step forward was to start breaking down those silos with this concept of connected data. So this lets you easily and securely share data across different parts of your business, or even to your second and third party companies that you operate with, maybe your suppliers or other businesses that you interact with day to day. So once again, this meant that now you have a unified single model of governing all of your data, but you can still have the different parts of your business operating with autonomy. But then we still started to see another set of silos emerge, and this time it was more different personas within a business, and in particular, people like data engineers or data scientists, machine learning engineers, who were using different languages like Java, Python, and Scala to perform analysis of their data. And they were then needing to move data out of Snowflake, once again creating this problem of multiple data silos, more places to govern your data. So we added first-class support for other languages beyond our original SQL roots. So you can now use Java, Python, and Scala. And as you can see at the bottom right there, we also introduced this concept of applications within Snowflake, the data platform. And we're going to return to that a little bit later in the presentation. But before that, why is Snowflake useful specifically in the context of experimentation? Well, firstly, there's this concept of Snowflake being the unified source of all of the data in your business. This is super important because a lot of the time in a specific experimentation tool, you might not have access to combine all of those data sets in one place. But Snowflake lets you bring in data from whatever tools you're using, whether it's CRM tools like Salesforce, your customer support tickets in Zendesk, chat in Intercom, and even your clickstream events coming directly from your apps or websites. So unifying all that data and being able to combine it and calculate more advanced combined metrics is one big advantage of a data platform. Another advantage of Snowflake, like I mentioned with that programmable data theme, is that you can also start to add more nuanced metrics or attributes onto your data. So for example, you could use a machine learning function in Python to do something like predict users who are most likely to churn, or perhaps users who are most likely to upsell based on all of those aggregate data sources. Maybe the people who opened a lot of tickets in Zendesk in the last few weeks are more likely to churn, for example. And then, last but not least, Snowflake is very scalable. Whether you're a small team, like the team I used to work on a few years ago, with one person managing your whole data platform, or you're a large multinational organization processing petabytes of data, all of that is catered to given the scalability of Snowflake. And you only ever pay for the compute that you use. Now, this isn't quite the theme of the talk today, but I couldn't resist putting in one slide just to show some of the AI features that we're also building into our platform. So what you're seeing here is a short video of a tool we have called Cortex Analyst. And essentially, this is a talk to your data type of tool. So this means that users in your business don't need to use languages like SQL or Python to engage with data. But you can even just ask questions in natural language. And what this is going to do is convert that into a query on your data with understanding of all the semantic meaning of those different data sets in your business, run that query, and return the results along with an explanation back to you. So you can imagine how, for perhaps a product manager or a persona who doesn't want to have to go and write the queries themselves, this could be a great way to dig deeper into the experiments you're running and also remove bottlenecks on the analyst teams in your company. So we said we'd be talking about applications. So I think it's worth addressing, why do you need an application in a data platform? What we started to see in relation to this data silos problem is that often when a company wanted to unlock the value of their core enterprise data with the other tools they were using, this required a lot of point-to-point integration work. Maybe you're integrating with an API for one tool. For another tool, you had to maybe transfer some data or do some kind of ETL process to move that data into the tool. And this led to a lot of duplicated effort for your team, building all these sort of one-to-one integration points. It also meant that, once again, you were moving data outside of that secure governance perimeter of Snowflake, and that immediately starts to create problems with security and IT departments. So Snowflake introduced the concept of applications to our platform, and this meant that now a provider or app builder could implement their logic and distribute that application through the Snowflake platform, through our marketplace. And that meant that consumers, or you as the people who want to use those applications, could just easily install those directly into your Snowflake account and bring the compute to where your data is already sitting within that secure governance perimeter. So this meant you could now start to unlock a lot more value from your data using all these different third-party applications without making compromises around your security perimeter or relying on your developers to build all these integrations with different tools. So there are a few different patterns to build applications in Snowflake. I'm going to just explain two of these today, which are relevant to how the LaunchDarkly application is being built. But essentially, there's different models ranging from the entire application running within your Snowflake account through to the entire application running in the account of the builder of that application. So first up, let's talk about the native application architecture. And like the name implies here, this is where you have an application that runs entirely within your Snowflake account. Everything from the data layer through to the processing and even the UI is all running within your security perimeter. This is really useful because it simplifies procurement of applications. It means that nothing is leaving your security perimeter at all. And you're able to get up and running really quickly with these applications. Just a couple of clicks to install them from the Snowflake marketplace. And it also means that it's easier to procure these applications in terms of you can use your standard Snowflake capacity to pay for these applications with some limitations on the amount. So this is the kind of all-in your account approach. The connected application architecture is another really common pattern we see. And this is where the provider or the app builder might already have their own existing application. They've built this great web app. That's where all your users know to access that tool, like LaunchDarkly. But at the same time, you want to start to unlock the value of all this business data that's specific to your business within that application. So the connected app architecture combines the best of both worlds there, where the provider is still using their standard application, running in AWS, for example, but they're pushing down some of the data work to your Snowflake account, which means, once again, you're still not having to worry about that security perimeter of your company's proprietary data. So now let's look at how the LaunchDarkly application is being built. And essentially, this is a hybrid of those two models that I just explained. So first up, to get started, all you need to do is install the native application into your Snowflake account. And what this is going to allow is for you to easily set up a secure connection between LaunchDarkly and your Snowflake account. It's going to guide you through that process in an intuitive UI. And it's also going to let you customize how your data is made available back to LaunchDarkly. So this is going to let you do things like pick the data sets that you want to add to the app and also apply policies to that data so that you can restrict how that data is shared back. For example, only if it's aggregated to a certain level of granularity. This means that, once again, you're removing risk from that proprietary data you've got and not having to worry about adding extra vendors to your data processing contracts or things like that. So once you've set up this initial native app directly in your Snowflake account, you've then got this connection over to LaunchDarkly, and now your LaunchDarkly users, just from the web UI, can start to unlock the value from that Snowflake data with the policies that you've created being applied at the source. So let's put this all together in an end-to-end architecture just to hopefully bring together some of these concepts. Like I mentioned before, you'll typically have a number of different data sources from your business feeding into Snowflake. That could include your CRM data, your support tickets, whatever it is. And you may likely also have things like clickstream data coming directly from all of your applications. You typically land that in something like a bronze or raw layer in Snowflake, which is just the same format as the source systems. And I'll just call out here that Snowflake supports not only loading data in batch, but also streaming data, which you can then query in near real time. So once you've got all this raw data from your source systems in Snowflake, then you'll typically start to combine and aggregate that data into a format that's more useful for downstream use cases in your business. And this is where you might start to take advantage of things like those Python functions I talked about, maybe adding your propensity to churn or propensity to upsell metrics to your data. And you could even use LLM-based functions. One of my favorites is classify text, which is just a simple function. You give it a text, block of text, and a list of categories, and it's going to classify that text into one of those categories. So for example, maybe you have a customer call transcript or a support ticket they raised. You want to classify that into one of 5 categories. This function's just going to do that for you without any expertise required. So all of that finally brings you to a gold data set at the other end of those transformations, where you've got all of those additional attributes that you've now added and enriched across all your different systems. This is now the point where you want to start unlocking value from that data set. And this is where the LaunchDarkly app comes in. So we can now make that gold data set available to LaunchDarkly with any appropriate aggregation policies applied to it. And you can now start to run more sophisticated experiments using those attributes that you've added to your data. So you can split out into new groups. Maybe you want to target something specifically at your power users, give them early access to a feature, or maybe you want to divide your experiment groups based on some of those attributes you calculated. And not only that, but once you then start to get the metrics on how that experiment's performing, you can then also analyze that data in relation to those advanced attributes you've calculated in Snowflake. So that gives us this end-to-end architecture all running within AWS and all secure between Snowflake and LaunchDarkly. So now I'll hand back to Aaron to walk us through the bringing that all together.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. All right, okay, so we have created this application to work closely with Snowflake. What does this actually bring to us? What it brings to us is the ability to run experiments with advanced analysis. And that means that we now have essentially 3 pathways, right? So we have LaunchDarkly-based analysis. These are experiments that run end-to-end within LaunchDarkly. A ton of your experiments in a scaled-up experimentation program will fit right into this category. They don't need sensitive proprietary information. They don't need information that maybe even comes directly from your single source of truth. They can just run on their own. This is fine. But for the rest of your experiments, you do need some of this hands-on analysis or more advanced features. And in that side, we have 2 other pathways. One is the bring your own analysis pathway. In this pathway, you are sending us, you're sending your LaunchDarkly data directly to Snowflake. And you do your own analysis. And that amount of data it's a large amount of data and it's a rich data set. And then the third pathway, LaunchDarkly is responsible for the entire experiment end-to-end in your warehouse. And we'll take a look at what this looks like a little bit. So in warehouse experimentation, there's an experiment builder. A Snowflake native experiment is available to you, and you can use this to manage experiments in LD because this fits your development model. In an experiment builder export-only experiment, we get a minimal setup in the LaunchDarkly side, and you're going to run your own analysis in the Snowflake side with your own models. In the experiment results, but Snowflake-derived metrics version of this, or what we would kind of consider pure play warehouse experimentation, the dashboards are presented in LaunchDarkly, and they're based on metrics that live in your Snowflake instance. This allows you to find an in-between spot where you use our analysis, but the data is not data that you send directly to us. And this allows all kinds of options for you and a much more wide array of what you can do. The other thing about warehouse experimentation is that you end up with 2 platforms here, right? One is the LaunchDarkly side where your developers or maybe your PMs or product owners can manage the experiment. In the dashboard, they already manage their features in. And the other side is the data that gets into Snowflake where you can run your own analysis, things that we wouldn't typically show or things that require proprietary data that we don't have access to and you wouldn't want to send to us. All right, let's recap this a little bit. To scale your experimentation program, we provided some tips, right? Parameter-driven experimentation, a simple-to-use experimentation dashboard, and data slicing for what we would consider basic personalization. Adding the Snowflake integration allows for a whole other set of capabilities. Trusted Snowflake-based metrics that are vetted by your organization, and a seamless integration with your source of truth and your experimentation platform. And the culmination of these things is that everybody's happy. This brings everybody together. And what essentially you have is a way for you to run experiments in any manner that are fit for your organization. OK, we're closing up here, and we're going to have some time for Q&A. But I did want to encourage folks to come and visit us at our booth. So the LaunchDarkly booth is at it's booth number 1970, and the Snowflake booth is booth 714, and they're both on the showroom floor. So come by and talk to us, and we'll be happy to go in depth on a lot of these concepts and other concepts that have to do with LaunchDarkly or Snowflake. We'll also be we're also having an event at Cut by Wolfgang Puck on December 4th, and please join us at the Snowball, which is a networking event at Tau, and that's on December 3rd. Okay.